I will start from scratch. So welcome to the folks who have joined the call. We have about 230 folks that have registered to participate. We are also recording this, and so we will make sure to share that with you when we're done. And we're also planning on putting it onto our Facebook live stream. Well, it won't exactly be live, but we'll put it on there tomorrow so that the public can be a part of this process. And that's why we're so excited that Julie Tierney, Chief of Staff for FDA, CBER FDA, was willing to join us today. We know the public has so many questions about vaccines and the safety and the process of approving the vaccines. There's a lot going on in the news, and there's a lot of confusion out there. So it's wonderful to have Julie here. I also have Sarah Dupre, who is our spectacular chair of Vaccinate Your Family. I don't know what we would do without her. She's going to help do some of the Q&As for us, and she has a wonderful understanding of the whole process as well, and really is a guiding light for us. She really brings us through the world of vaccines every day. So again, thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, we do encourage you to put them into the Q&A anytime during the presentations that you'll see today. And we're going to get to as many as possibly can. We know this, we really want this to be a very participatory process. So a little bit about Vaccinate Your Family before we move on. I'm Amy Pisani, and I'm the Executive Director. I've been here for a long time now, almost 20 years. Our organization was founded almost 30 years ago. Next year, it will be our 30-year anniversary. And we have a very broad mission to ensure the vaccination of people of all age groups. Many of you know that we used to be called Every Child by Two, and we broadened our mission several years ago in order to protect people of all ages. We have a lot of different audiences. We do a tremendous amount of policy work, but we use personal stories. We try to weave it throughout everywhere we can. When we give the facts, we also try to tell why it matters. And so we have a series of amazing new videos that I hope you'll come and visit on our site. And we also have answers to all the questions you can imagine, all the most frequently asked questions. They're on our site. So if you're having, folks that are asking you questions, we do welcome you to come to our site. If you don't see the answer to anything that you need out there, please let us know, and we will find the answer for you, and we will, post it for the public and for you. So just a couple things I wanted to mention before we move forward. We put out every year what's called the annual State of the Immune Report. And this is a report to Congress. It's also really very helpful just in developing all of your priorities for the year. These are the areas that we feel are the greatest needs of the community, the biggest challenges that our nation is facing, so to speak. And of course, we put it out, as you can imagine, the week of the State of the Union. So we send it up to Congress, and you can see that in our regular report this year, we talked a lot about disparities again. We talk about disparities in all of our reports, and there's really an untenable level of disparities among adults. And we're also always seeing disparities based on your insurance coverage. I know the Vaccines for Children program has been really a lifesaver for many children, literally a lifesaver. But there's a lot of gaps out there, and those gaps are starting to become very evident as we're dealing with this terrible COVID crisis. Now, we did a special edition of the State of the Union on COVID, and in there we gave just 5 quick steps important, critical steps that Congress can take to help us help them. It's really about funding the immunization programs. There's a lot of different bills that are out there. Yesterday, we saw an update to the House HEROES package, and in that, we're finally seeing some funding. And I won't go into details on funding, but I do encourage you to write to us at info@vaccineyourfamily.org and join our mailing list, because on there is where you're going to find out the latest on what's happening with regard to policy. And there's just a lot of different areas. We work with amazing partners at the 317 Coalition and the Adult Vaccine Access Coalition on all of these access issues that have been challenging our country for years, but now they absolutely must be resolved in order for us to save people from this deadly virus, COVID. So again, we're looking at Medicare Part D, covering the cost. I know that it's supposedly free vaccine for everyone. Still not a lot answered on how it will be paid for providers and pharmacists, et cetera, the administration fees. So there's just a lot of different pieces of legislation out there that we want you to keep an eye on. So this is how you access our State of the Union report. It's really easy. You just go to our page, you go to Support Vaccines, Make a National Impact, and boop to the left, all of our reports are in there. from all the years, and they're filled with really great graphics. We try our very best to take all of this like data, which is always easy to describe to the public in a palpable way. And we try to create really good graphics to help people understand what the data means, what it means when you say that 30% of kids aren't getting vaccinated because they're not insured, or what various pieces of data. So as we wait the vaccines, there are a lot of efforts out there taking place to ensure equitable distribution. And before I hand things over to Julie, I just wanted to mention a couple of things for our partners, just to keep an eye on. We would do more detail. I have a really long presentation that Sarah and I did for the Democrat LAs, and I won't go into detail on that, but as many of you know, the ACIP is going to be given guidance from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They gave their initial framework about a month ago. I don't know if it's been a month already, it seems like a month. We did a first comment draft, and you can see the link there for our comments. WHO and Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Medicine also have a strategy that they're looking at. And I think they're doing a good job. They're hitting all the right issues, and ACIP is going to be looking at them more in detail. This was presented at the meeting. One thing I will tell you, if you're watching now, if you watch the ACIP meetings live, which I really encourage you to do, I have to tell you, last week's meeting was my favorite ACIP meeting of all time. Just amazing information was given out. You have to download the slides immediately. They put them on their website the day of the meeting, but they have to take them down afterwards to make them compliant. So if anyone really wants some of the slides, I can give them to you if you send me an email. I think I'm allowed to do that. But I do encourage you to pull those slides down immediately, and then, because otherwise you have to wait. Today they put out the June slides, so otherwise I guess we have to wait a couple months. As you can see, there's different priority groups, and Johns Hopkins, National Academies, they're very similar in their Tier 1 and Tier 2 groupings. WHO hasn't put out their framework yet exactly, so we don't know exactly what they're looking at. And then Kathleen Dooling presented this at the meeting, and I thought it was really important. And there's a lot of different breakdowns of this information that really goes into the different high-risk medical conditions. And just, to me, it was really interesting to see, like, we're looking at vaccinating essential workers, healthcare personnel, and adults 65 years and older. But there's a lot of those folks who are also in the high-risk medical conditions area. And so the way that you slice it and dice it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need 80 million doses for essential workers and then healthcare personnel 20 million, because some of those will overlap into the high-risk medical conditions as well. So again, this is just a snippet of what we saw during the meeting. And then this is another piece of for the obesity among essential workers, which again, we know is a high-risk condition for severe outcomes to COVID. And something I was really excited to see, Tom Shimabukuro presented on a new system that they're looking at to track the essential workers vaccinations for the first couple of months, I suppose it would be. And I think it's a really amazing idea. They're planning on doing a text system. And what will happen is, if there's an adverse event, if they sign up for the texting and there's an adverse event, they will somehow, I don't know the exact details, but they will process it through the vaccine adverse event reporting system. And it's just another way of keeping track of the safety of this vaccine, along with the many other systems that are in place here in the US. And I think we'll talk about a little bit about that later, possibly. So now it is really my pleasure to introduce you to Julie Tierney. She is the Chief of Staff at the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And I'll let Julie tell you a little bit about herself, but I'll let you know that the mission of CBER is to ensure the safety, purity, potency, and effectiveness of biological products, including vaccines, allergenics, blood and blood products, and cells, tissues, and gene therapies for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of human diseases, conditions, or injury. Through their mission, they seek to protect the public against threats of emerging infectious diseases and bioterrorism. So Julie, thank you. Julie, thank you so very much for joining us. And she goes by Julia officially, but she's Julie to her friends, and so she's Julie here today.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I'd say I'd answer to Julia, Julie, as my mom would say, you can call me anything, just don't call me late for dinner. So thanks so much for having me here today. So I'm the Chief of Staff at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA. I've been with the agency for a little over 12 years, with CBER for almost 4. I am an attorney by training, so I hope folks don't hold that against me. I have some time in private practice in the Chief Counsel's office at FDA, and also spent some time down on the HELP committee working on 21st century cures. So without further ado, though, I'm happy to give you a talk today to talk about sort of overview of the vaccine development process generally, and with respect to COVID-19 vaccines, and FDA's role there, because I think there's a lot of confusion, a lot of different players, and hopefully giving you some insight into what FDA's role is and sort of how we think that we can help with development of high quality, safe, and effective vaccines, and increase public confidence in those vaccines once they're available. Hopefully this talk will help you sort of have some insight there as well. So let me try to share my screen. Good. There we go. Great. So as I said, I'm going to provide an overview of the vaccine development process and FDA's role in the scientific and regulatory oversight of vaccines, and sort of how we help to ensure the quality, safety, and effectiveness of vaccines along the way. Amy already provided some background about FDA's mission, which is to protect and promote the public health, and a key way that we do that is by ensuring the safety and effectiveness of the medical products we regulate, as well as helping to speed innovations that can help patients. These are the various medical products we regulate. The Center for Biologics regulates vaccines, obviously, since I'm here, as well as other complex biologics like cell and gene therapies and blood products. Right, so FDA is sort of involved soup to nuts from the beginning through the marketing of vaccines along the way in a lot of different ways. You know, we help with the strain selection for the annual influenza vaccines. We actually produce reference standards that vaccine manufacturers use to produce their products. We're involved in the lot release of vaccines to make sure that they meet quality standards. First, we evaluate the safety and effectiveness of vaccines before they're marketed, and then once they're marketed, we have a key role in post-market surveillance. Along the way, we are giving technical advice to manufacturers and researchers about the design of their clinical trial programs, and to some extent with respect to their distribution programs. And I think one of the key roles that we play, though, is to help ensure public confidence. And one way that we are hoping to do that is by being as transparent as we can about our role and about the products that we're considering and our thinking in terms of authorizing those to be available to the public. So just to sort of highlight the importance of public confidence, I feel like I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here, given the audience, but you know, you can see when you look at the effects of people who get measles and the horrible side effects that people have, after they have measles, including permanent hearing loss, hospitalizations, and then you look at the side effects for people when they got the vaccine, you can really see why we think of vaccines as sort of one of this century's most important public health advances. So, actually, just wanted to talk about the measles and the MMR vaccine, and then of course the annual flu vaccine as well, and the importance of people having confidence that it works, that it's safe. A vaccine is only effective if people are willing to take it. We've got different approaches that manufacturers are taking with respect to developing COVID vaccines and targeting different parts of the virus. So this just is a graphic showing that. And then these are some examples of the different parts of the virus that the vaccines are trying to target the immune system to recognize and have immunity to. So there's a whole range of them, and I think that it's to our advantage to have a number of different approaches that we're taking in development. Great. So just taking like the 10,000-foot view of vaccine development and how it's developed, approved, manufactured. First we start in phase 1 clinical trials after there's been some animal testing or non-clinical testing to ensure that we feel that it's safe enough to go into humans. There's testing in healthy volunteers. Moving on to phase 2, which is looking mostly at the safety. It's a much larger study. And then finally in phase 3, when we talk about vaccines that are given to, hundreds of thousands of individuals, including healthy people, we really need to have a very good picture of its safety. So you've got very, very large clinical trials in the phase 3, and that is the case for the COVID-19 trials as well. I'm sure people are aware the sponsors have the lead candidates have been pretty public about their development plans thus far. So, we're looking at some of these trials are in phase 3. Some of them are a little bit not quite there, moving along well. So we'll see what happens. But ultimately, all of this evidence goes to showing whether a vaccine is safe and effective, whether its benefits outweigh its risks. And then FDA is going to look at that clinical data, the non-clinical data, to look at the safety and effectiveness, but also the manufacturing. It's really critical when you're talking about complex biologics to consider the manufacturing process and make sure that you are seeing a consistent product time and time again, because that can very much impact its safety and effectiveness. Right. So with COVID-19 vaccine development in particular, I think I mentioned that FDA all along the way is giving technical advice to sponsors as they're designing their clinical trials, as they're designing their development programs. And so through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been providing very rapid feedback to sponsors and technical advice about the data that they need to support the manufacturing, their clinical development, and finally, approval or authorization of their vaccine. We issued guidance in June of 2020 that provides a good amount of detail about what we would expect to see in a successful program, and I'll provide some details about that a little bit later in the presentation, but sort of gets at what we would expect to see in order to support licensure of a safe and effective vaccine, and that's ultimately what we all want to get to. So in addition to sort of providing this individual feedback to individual sponsors, we've also been working collaboratively with our federal partners, such as CDC and NIH, as well as international regulatory counterparts, to help facilitate efficient development programs by all of these sponsors. And I want to talk a little bit about these vaccine development timelines, which I think there's been, some concern over whether they're shortened and whether that means we're going to end up with unsafe or ineffective vaccines. And what we're focusing on is having, clinical, non-clinical, and clinical development move along as quickly as we can, and sponsors designing trials so they can enroll large numbers of people rapidly. At the same time, something that's unusual, I think, given the COVID-19 pandemic, is that manufacturers are actually starting to manufacture their products before they know whether their clinical trials will be successful. So that's different from traditional vaccine development, where it's very stepwise. You do your non-clinical, your clinical studies, and then you look at how to manufacture large commercial scale versions of your product. Here, they're taking a risk that's being funded in large part by the government in some cases to manufacture the product so that as soon as they know that their product is safe and effective, it will be ready to go and be deployed. So that way we've got some vaccine development timelines, I think, that are shortened without compromising safety and efficacy standards. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple things about our guidance that we released in June of 2020, which I think is, you could think of as a roadmap to successful development for COVID-19 vaccines. And I am not a scientist by training, so I'm not going to try to get too in the weeds. I'm going to admit I did not actually even take a statistics class in college. But some important things about this is that we are expecting to see development programs that pursue traditional approval, meaning that they're based on direct clinical evidence of vaccine safety and effectiveness. So we're looking at whether or not the vaccines are protecting individuals from actually being infected by COVID-19. For some diseases that we know a lot about, we're able to look at whether or not there's an immune response and sort of use that as a surrogate measure of whether or not a vaccine is effective. Here, we're learning about the virus as we go, and so we're looking right now at development programs that show clinical evidence of effectiveness. So I just wanted to sort of drive that home. We're actually looking at whether or not the vaccine is more effective than placebo in preventing disease. We expect to see efficacy of at least 50%, with a confidence interval that would get it at above 30% at its lowest bound. This is sort of in line with some other vaccines. So we think that it hits a good point. Obviously, it could be higher, it could be lower. We want to have the most effective vaccines possible, but our scientists think that this is a reasonable expectation. And that efficacy endpoint estimate would apply to both interim and final analysis. And as the products move into late phase studies, they have actually planned interim analysis based on whether or not they achieve a certain number of cases that a separate board called a Data Safety Monitoring Board would look at to see whether or not the clinical trial actually has achieved its goal, whether or not the product is effective, and sort of whether or not the trial should continue at that point. In terms of safety considerations, even though folks are building up these safety databases quickly, we're asking sponsors, advising sponsors that they should be trying to look at a safety evaluation with a database that's been about in the same range as other preventative vaccines. So we're looking at very large phase 3 trials that are, in the tens of thousands, and we're hoping, and we think that will give us sufficient evidence about the safety of the disease. And we also have some advice in our guidance about follow-up that needs to be long enough to evaluate safety, both sort of immediate adverse effects, but also things that happen a little bit later, but also the duration of the immune response triggered by the vaccine. And, as sort of that wanes, whether we see participants in the trial having increased cases of COVID-19, but also whether there's some vaccine-enhanced disease as well. And so we think that if sponsors follow the advice in terms of powering their efficacy trials, those will also provide an acceptable safety database. I want to talk a little bit about clinical trial diversity because I know that is a big concern for stakeholders, for the American public, because we want to make sure that these vaccines work in all Americans, and especially in groups that may be at increased chances of risk with COVID-19. So just following up on that basic diagram about the phase 1 and 2 and 3 trials. So the early phase studies are going to enroll healthy adults. And then as we get into later phase development, what we want to do is, make sure that sponsors are enrolling participants that might have medical comorbidities that are at risk if they were to get COVID-19. We also encourage enrollment of diverse populations that are most affected by COVID-19. So that includes racial and ethnic minorities, and we're working with sponsors to help them with their clinical trial design to make sure that we get there. We also have some recommendations in our guidance about how to support enrollment of elderly individuals, pregnant women, and women of childbearing potential that are not avoiding pregnancy, and finally pediatric populations. Now, I think folks are probably aware that we do not usually test medical products in children until we have shown its safety and effectiveness in the adult populations, and that's the case here. So none of the trials right now are including pediatric populations because we do need to have more evidence of benefit before we can move it into pediatric trials. But obviously that's a very important element of full deployment of any of these vaccines. Right. So I want to sort of say this very directly and out loud, that FDA will only approve or authorize a COVID vaccine that's met our rigorous and science-based standards for quality, safety, and effectiveness. We have some of the best scientists and physicians in the country and the world working here at FDA, and working around the clock to apply these standards that are based in our law and applied with the best science that we have. And we are working to ensure and we have the commitment from our leadership that process is going to be science-based and free from interference. So we're really hopeful that people will feel confident in our decision making. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think will help people feel more confident as well. So again, those decisions about whether or not to authorize or approve a vaccine are going to be made by FDA scientific and medical experts following an evaluation of the totality of the evidence about the safety and effectiveness of a vaccine. FDA does not decide when a sponsor thinks they're ready to come in to which pathway they're going to choose. So there's two pathways that they could choose if they think that their clinical development program is close to done. One is an emergency use authorization, and we refer to that as an EUA or authorization, and the other is a biologic license application. So that's sort of the traditional approval or licensure. Our expectation is that if a sponsor chooses an EUA pathway, that they would do that as a first step with the ultimate goal of getting a biologic license application. Great. So, just to return to the theme about public confidence, we recognize that transparency is an important element of this, and we're committed to being as transparent as possible as we can about our decision making, about the factors that we would consider. We do have statutory restrictions on the data that we can talk about for unapproved products, but we're trying to ensure that there's a lot of sunlight into our decision making. And one way we're going to do that is through our Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So this is FDA's standing advisory committee regarding vaccines and related products. It consists of external experts who provide us with non-binding recommendations about the safety and effectiveness of our products. And this is a really good mechanism for us to get external input, and I think also to make sure that we have some sunlight again on our decision making. So traditionally, advisory committee meetings can either be about a general topic, and we're going to have one of those in October 22nd, or we're going to talk about the general topic of development, authorization, or licensure of COVID-19 vaccines, so sort of some general considerations there. But also advisory committee meetings can be specific to a particular product, and we expect to convene an open session of our VRPAC prior to the issuance of any EUA or BLA for COVID-19, where we talk about the safety and effectiveness data and whether it supports authorizing or approving that particular vaccine. So, and we are working hard to make sure that that is as public as possible through webcasting means, looking at other means, because we know there's going to be a lot of interest in our decision here, and really people understanding the data that supports a product if it were to be authorized, and understanding where our decision making came from in terms of the standard and sort of how we got there, I think will be really important to confidence in the decision making overall. So the end goal is approval of a COVID-19 vaccine. So this is a decision that FDA makes. We determine that a vaccine is safe, pure, and potent, or safe and effective. As I mentioned, our June 2020 guidance on the development and licensure of vaccines to prevent COVID-19 provides a lot of technical details about what we think the pathway is to get to licensure in terms of the design of trials, how the product should be manufactured, and our expectations there. So the other mechanism that I think folks have probably heard a lot about that you don't hear about outside of an emergency is the emergency use authorization, or EUA authority. So this is a mechanism that allows FDA to authorize an unapproved product or an unapproved use of an approved product that diagnoses, treats, or prevents a life-threatening disease or condition that's caused by a threat agent like the COVID-19 virus, when there's no adequate, approved, and available alternative. So there's a number of statutory criteria that have to be met before FDA could do that. And I think, as I mentioned before, we are not going to authorize or approve a vaccine that does not meet our standards. So of relevance here is sort of this basement that the product may be effective. So for approval, a product has to be safe and effective. There has to be substantial evidence of effectiveness. For an EUA, The standard is the product may be effective, but that is the basement. And really the crux of the issue here is that we have to determine, FDA has to determine that the product's known and potential benefits exceed its known and potential risks. And this benefit risk assessment for vaccines that we acknowledge are potentially going to be administered to millions of people, including healthy individuals, all at once, very rapidly deployed, so different than probably any vaccination campaign that we've seen in the past. That benefit risk assessment is very different than if you're talking about a product that is given to individuals who are in the hospital, who are on ventilators, who may pass away. We're talking about healthy individuals, and so you really need to make sure that we have clear and compelling evidence of its safety and effectiveness before we would feel comfortable issuing an EUA there. And we also, as I mentioned, want to see that there's adequate manufacturing information to ensure the consistency and quality of the product, because that can really affect its performance. So in terms of timing, in our June 2020 guidance, we set forward our expectation that we think that it's very likely that an EUA, that really the circumstance where an EUA would be appropriate is once the studies have demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of vaccines. So the clinical development program is just about wrapping up, but before the manufacturer has taken the additional steps of doing all of the technical submission and to support a BLA. So, you know, that sort of is, I think, a little different than when you're talking about EUAs for therapeutics, and I just wanted to drive that point home. And then part of the whirlwind tour of vaccine development, I just want to mention about the sort of post-market safety surveillance, and that's a really critical issue and one that we are going to be collaborating with our colleagues at CDC about. After approval of a BLA or issuance of an EUA, we're going to be closely monitoring the safety of those vaccines using existing surveillance systems such as theirs, such as FDA's VET system, our biologic effectiveness and safety. Oh, I can't remember the last T, but it's part of our Sentinel program. And there may be cases where we require a manufacturer to conduct post-marketing studies if there are some known or potential serious risks that we identify. And we have that authority to do that as a condition of licensure. So I think, we're going to be working with, in summary, we're going to be working with developers to make sure that they are implementing development programs that give them the most robust evidence possible to support, ultimately to support licensure, and that we may consider an emergency use authorization a little bit before that. All along, we are working with them to make sure that there is robust data that's being generated by their clinical trials, and that we are able to look at that and evaluate it and really determine that a product is safe and effective before we make it available to the public. And then we're going to continue to work with them afterwards to make sure that we're monitoring for any potential side effects that happen after the fact, because even the largest clinical trials are not going to show all of the side effects that might happen once a product gets into general use. So that is a whirlwind tour of FDA's role in vaccine development. And I don't know if Sarah or Amy have further comments, or if we wanted to open it up for Q&A now.
Thank you so much, Julie. We are going to open up for Q&A, and so I'll ask Sarah and Julie and myself to go on to video mode. Fantastic. And Jennifer, I'm not sure if there's a special key you have to hit to make it so that everyone can see gallery mode, but I think everyone can. Julie, you're still off, though.
It says I can't. It's been stopped.
Here we go. There you go.
Great.
Fabulous. Great. So Sarah has some questions for you, and then I'm going to read some of the questions. I got a couple by email, and I have some from the Q&A chat. So, all right, I just muted you. Now try to unmute yourself. Here you go. Okay, I'll ask the first question while Sarah's figuring it out, okay? So, here we go. So our first question is from Ann Lewandowski from Wisconsin, and she said that her biggest question for the FDA is what independent committees will be used to evaluate the EUA, and also, will the final decision go through the ACIP?
I'll speak to the first part. So we have committed to convening our VRPAC for either an EUA or a BLA. So before we were to issue an EUA or approve a BLA, we would bring that to our VRPAC, which is an independent advisory committee. Ultimately, FDA is the decision maker, but they provide us with recommendations and expert input on that safety and effectiveness data.
Okay. Another question we had.
With respect to the ACIP, I'll defer to you all. I know that CDC is working on that, but that's not part of FDA's role. So I don't know if you all can provide some more information on that.
Well, why don't we chat about that once we move forward. Okay. Another question that we have is, does the FDA have any projections on how long COVID vaccine would be distributed under the EUA before it receives full approval?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think a lot of that might depend on timing of submissions, which are sort of not within FDA's control. If we were to, say, get an EUA before the submission of a BLA and or to authorize it, that the review of a BLA is a multi-month process. So I think that would be the best estimate of potentially the shortest amount of time between an EUA and a BLA.
Okay. Okay. And Sarah, are you able to speak yet? Can we hear you now?
I can speak. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Perfect. So, Julie, thank you so much. I thought you did a great job. COVID vaccines 101, 201. So that was super helpful. And I have a long list of questions, but I wanted to start with just one clarifying question about the difference between an EUA and a BLA. And so this is my understanding is that with a BLA, if a sponsor, usually it will be the vaccine company, brings a BLA to FDA, and the BLA meets the standard, FDA must approve, there's no discretion. With an EUA, and I know sometimes those EUAs are brought forward by ASPR as opposed to the company, but whoever brings it forward, there's a standard, but the standard's discretionary, so that even if the product meets the standard, FDA is not obligated to authorize the product. Is that correct?
That is correct, Sarah, the shall versus may. And I think that reflects a lot of the flexibility that's in the EUA standard in order to deal with particular emergencies, to deal with particular products. And I think that's why it's so important to us and why we have that expectation around the robust data that would need to support an EUA, where you might see that it would be appropriate to grant an EUA for a therapeutic with a different benefit risk. When we talk about sort of legally required to issue it versus a discretionary EUA standard, the other thing that we think about is not only we don't want to authorize or approve a product that we wouldn't take ourselves, that we wouldn't give to have our family members take, but when you're talking about a public health emergency where you have so many people that are dying every day, we have to consider that also when we think about the appropriateness of an EUA.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do want to say, I think that the career staff and the commissioner of late too have been quite clear that, there's a commitment that science will rule here, appreciating the kinds of balancing acts that you just described that are very important, but that this will be a decision based on science, and that FDA is working very hard to keep the politics out of it. And I think that's super important. And as the public thinks about getting a COVID vaccine, and for those people who may be hesitant because they are concerned about the process, what would you say from your vantage point as a career staff at FDA?
Yeah, so speaking for myself and for so many of my colleagues, the public health is really my North Star. We are a group of folks that have chosen a particular profession based in science, based in regulation, and committed to helping people, to protecting the public health and promoting it. I have great confidence in my colleagues that are doing the scientific and medical evaluation. I have great confidence in Peter Marks. And so I hope that we can preserve the public's confidence in the agency, that we can continue that, and that some of the transparency that we're taking on can help with that as well.
And as we think about the potential for political pressure, and the potential that there could be politics that could interfere with the decision-making process, can you talk about what kinds of mechanisms there are in place to ensure that political pressure doesn't play a role here?
Right. So I think one thing just to bring up as background is that these decisions around products are made by the agency's career scientific staff, and there are delegations in place to give that down to the center, to the chief scientist in the case of emergency use authorizations, and it's very, very rare for a commissioner to get involved in those product decisions, and he has committed not to be involved. Of course, he's briefed on all of these issues, but I take him at his word that he's going to uphold our scientific integrity, and I think that we're working to do that. And yeah.
So another issue that comes up a lot is diversity in the clinical trials, and we know that we saw one company, Moderna, that actually put their trials on pause in order to improve recruitment of minority participants. And I can't decide if that was a good thing or a bad thing. It's a bummer that they had to do it. It's good that they did do it. But could you talk about the FDA's role in ensuring there's robust participation of minorities, and then also like pregnant women, lactating people, that kind of diversity across the participants?
Right. So, this is something where we want to make sure that the vaccine is safe and effective across all different groups. And we know that there is, to be frank, a historic mistrust among some communities with medical research, and that is in addition to the pandemic affecting those communities more than others. Those are challenges for sponsors, for FDA, for our colleagues across HHS. We are working hard to encourage sponsors to think about ways that they can increase the diversity, to help to work with some of those groups to give some transparency into FDA's decision-making process, so that perhaps they would feel more comfortable with where things are headed. And I think that applies for racial and ethnic minorities, and then pregnant and lactating people as well. That's something that we are working with sponsors to make sure that there's appropriate enrollment. That does need to be supported, I think, by science when you're talking about sort of that additional vulnerability. So we're working with our sponsors, giving advice on what type of non-clinical data they need to get there. Ultimately, that is a responsibility that does lie on the folks that are doing the development. And as you mentioned, Moderna did pause their trials in order to try to figure out to get more enrollment among minority groups, and that's sort of a double-edged sword there. But that is really important and something that we are encouraging and working with sponsors to try to achieve.
Turning to the role of the advisory committee, so you mentioned that the Vaccines-Related Biologics Products Advisory Committee, quite a name, is going to have its first meeting on October 22nd, at least the first meeting that's been publicly announced or scheduled, and that'll be a general meeting. When it comes time for that advisory committee to review particular products, can you talk a little bit about how those meetings go? I mean, will they have an opportunity, the advisory committee members, to request more information? Do they engage in dialogue with FDA staff and the sponsors? And sort of how transparent and open is that process as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. So yeah, this is sort of a mechanism to get some transparency. And what we're hopeful that usually what happens is both the sponsor and FDA provide briefing materials about a particular product, and that goes through different reviews and is generally provided to the advisory committee members, hopefully as far in advance as possible, so that they can consider it and then have a well-informed conversation in the advisory committee meeting itself, which is open. Those materials are posted on FDA's webpage at least 2 days beforehand, so the public has a chance to also see what the advisory committee members are seeing before the open session, and then sort of what's driving the discussion. So there'll be presentations by FDA and the sponsor, and then some questions and answers from the advisory committee members. Now, it may be possible that part of the session is closed to discuss proprietary or trade secret manufacturing information, because as I said, sort of the quality and consistency that's related to the manufacturing process is so important here. That would be where materials would be provided to the advisory committee members, but would not be made publicly available, sort of the nitty-gritty of how a product is made. But that would be, we would get input from them about that. But then the rest of it, the safety and effectiveness data, that would be during an open session. And so we're working on making sure that we sort of got all of the, everything worked out in advance so that we can rapidly schedule those if we were to get an EUA or a BLA. So we're not sort of figuring out the logistics while we sort of have to work forward to get the
Put you in on mute real quick. Well, I'm going to ask a quick question, Sarah, on top of that.
Yeah.
Just, it's the same concept. The same question is, for the 1022 meeting on the EUA or B, what's the estimated amount of time the FDA will take to make a decision on the application?
Sorry about that. Hi.
You're fine. Did you hear that, Julie? So on top of the question of when, if there's a meeting on 1022, what's the estimated amount of time the FDA would take to make a decision? It could be pretty quickly, right?
1 second. Sorry.
We can hear you. Julie, we can hear you. Maybe she can't see us. I feel like I should play the Jeopardy song. Do, 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 do.
Enter your participant ID followed by pound.
I got it.
I see what's happening. This happens to me sometimes. I always dial in by phone
Panelist.
because then you end up, your feed breaks.
Recorded.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
That's no problem. Did you hear the last question, Julie?
So anyways, hopefully we'll have worked out all of those logistics issues when we when it comes time for our VRPAC meeting.
We're happy to be your sponsor for that.
Yeah, we'll make sure that I'm not the technical person to make sure that folks are able to watch it and see the deliberations.
Hey, Julie, I don't know if you heard me then. So someone wanted to know how long the process could take. So if there's a meeting on October 22nd, how long could it take?
So the meeting on October 22nd, just to be clear, that right now our plan is for that meeting to talk generally about the development, authorization, or licensure of vaccines to prevent COVID-19. So really talking about the general considerations that the agency has. So maybe like a longer version of what I just talked about, and maybe some discussion of the advice that we've been giving out to sponsors and that we have in our June guidance, and some feedback from and discussion from the advisory committee members on that. So that's not really a trigger of anything. That's more an opportunity for some discussion of where our general thinking is, and not about a particular vaccine.
Well, but I guess the question, Julie, if it were about a particular vaccine, could you talk a little bit about what the timeframes are? I mean, could you potentially authorize a vaccine for emergency use within several weeks of an advisory committee recommending that? And how long, and a BLA, what's the, I know these are all, priority review products, but what's the timeline for reviewing and approving that once an advisory committee has actually recommended it?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of this is going to be dependent on the particular product, and so I'm not trying to be sort of hedgy about it, but it's hard to commit to a particular time frame. I will say that, in order to help us and help facilitate sort of a timely review, we're having conversations with sponsors along the way so that we're familiar, say, with their manufacturing, so that kind of conversations are happening well before an EUA or a BLA is ever submitted. Sarah, you mentioned for BLA is priority review, and that's right. Most of I can't imagine that circumstance where these didn't qualify for priority review. And when we talk about priority review at FDA, it's sort of like getting to the weeds as an FDA wonk that I am. That means that we're looking at, instead of a 10-month review, which is how long it usually takes for a biologics license application to get reviewed, we target 6 months. And we can move even more quickly than that when it's a very high priority that has tremendous public health impact, and have approved vaccines in 3 to 4 months after submission of the BLA.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right, Sarah, I'm going to ask some of the questions that are in the chat now because we only have about 6 more minutes to go. So one question we wanted to know about, can you talk about the post-approval surveillance system, PRISM, which seems to have been dropped since it appeared in the safety presentation at ACIP? Is the FDA no longer using PRISM? So I think we're going to be looking at all the different systems that we can. Unfortunately, I'm not a post-marketing surveillance expert, and we're going to be working with the different sponsors to make sure that we have systems in place to make sure that we can look at whether or not adverse events are occurring and at what rate. So we're going to be exploring all of the different mechanisms. And, I'm happy to get back with you on more specifics, but that's something we're going to be working out along the way with sponsors. I don't think we're committed to particular platforms. Okay. Another question from Lisa at AVAC. The Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, we're talking about the difference between how many injuries that might occur if a vaccine is distributed initially under the EUA, which would go through the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, and then how will we transition it over to the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program once the vaccine receives full approval? I mean, you could foresee a scenario where the injury cases are going through the process at the same time under both systems, depending on whether or not the vaccine administered was approved under the EUA or receives a full approval. So it's kind of complicated, but it's a challenge that we're trying to work out.
Yeah, that's a great question and a little bit outside of FDA's bailiwick. Certainly, as I said, there's huge amounts of issues that need to be worked out, and those are a lot of the things that we and our colleagues throughout HHS are trying to work out in advance. So I don't feel like I'm in a position to opine on that, but that certainly is an important issue that folks will be considering.
Okay. We wanted to know also, someone asked what you meant when you said 50% effective when you were talking about the approval process. What did you mean by 50% effective?
Let me take a look back at my notes. So when we're looking at 50%, actually, you know what, now I'm getting caught up in statistics, so I don't want to say the wrong thing. That means that it is 50% more effective than the placebo that it's being compared to. And I think that if you take a look at our guidance, there are much more specific recommendations there and an explanation for it.
Okay, well, we'll be happy to share those with everyone who joined today too. Okay, so it's no problem. Another question is, are there additional consent requirements for products that are approved under the EUA?
Right, that's a good question. So under an EUA, there is, we do have these things called fact sheets that go with EUAs that sort of provide information that is similar to what you might see in a package insert, and that is going to make sure that folks realize that these are unapproved products and sort of the risks and benefits there.
Sarah, do you see another question that you wanted to ask typically. A lot of the questions about the clinical trials and the diversity were answered, so I didn't ask them particularly, but a lot of folks are really looking at that, how you're working with the manufacturers to ensure the diversity, and obviously that's a really big priority for everyone on this call.
Yeah, the only other question I had, and I don't know, Julie, if this is outside of your bailiwick, but you know, there's discussion of having ACIP review EUA vaccines as well, which I think, personally, I think would be important, and it's something they haven't done in the past. And so my question is the extent to which ACIP and CDC and FDA coordinate to some extent so that there isn't a lag if in fact FDA does recommend a vaccine or authorize it. Is ACIP being kept up to date, and do they have FDA members on the working group, on the COVID working group, and do ACIP members participate in VRPAC?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the exact membership overlap, but I can tell you that we are coordinating closely with CDC and thinking about, you know, when we talk about our VRPAC meeting and they're thinking about the ACIP meeting, you know, whether or not those briefing documents might be the same expected from sponsors, you know. And so we're working closely with them to make sure that there is not that type of lag, and that's exactly, you know, when we talk about this sort of coordinated federal response to expedite things, we're not talking about, you know, skipping steps in the development process, but really making sure that we're as tight as possible in terms of moving from showing something works to being able to deploy it.
And the 2-month post-vaccination data for the clinical trials, is that correct? That's what FDA wants to see?
I think that is what we generally have thought that we'd want to see, because that's when a lot of adverse events occur within those first 2 months.
Okay, great. All right. And one more thing, and I think, Sarah, we've talked about this before, but in EUA in the past, a couple people wanted to know about that. I think smallpox, can't think of another one. Was H1N1?
No, it's
anthrax, excuse
anthrax.
Me. Okay, so anthrax was the only EUA.
I believe that product had already been approved. Actually, I should let Julie speak.
That's right. It was an unapproved use of an approved licensed vaccine. Yeah, that's right. So this is, I think, well, as with most things COVID, this is really a whole new world for everyone. We do have EUAs that the center has issued. We issued an EUA for convalescent plasma. That's a therapeutic. That's going to be a different benefit risk assessment. And of course, the agency has been issuing EUAs since the beginning of the pandemic. But I think, you know, there are a lot of unique things around COVID-19 in terms of the very rapid deployment to millions of people that are really going to factor into our decision making here.
Well, Julie, we really want to thank you. You know, one of our Dorit Rice actually wrote one of the first Q&As, and I wanted to address it at the very end, because the question is really, can the FDA be more public and have a voice that's out there regularly talking about the process? And I know that that's why you reached out to us. And I know we really appreciate that, and we want to continue these conversations. And I know that Dr. Marks and Commissioner Hahn, they're working on speaking to other groups as well. And so I know that you've been very busy in your processes, and we would be more than happy to continue to host these events among other groups, and to let these folks on the call know when you're going to do other events. So if you keep in touch with us, we would be more than happy to share that. But again, we'd love to see you on TV. The more that you can share with the public, the greater the confidence will be. This is a really big challenge just normally in the vaccine world. And to have a COVID confidence, you know, faltering in our nation is really disappointing when we know it'll be a life-saving vaccines eventually. So thank you very much, Sarah, for joining, and Julie for talking so much to us, and to all our participants. If you have any more questions, just send them to me via email, info@vaccineyourfamily.org, and we'll try to get them over to Julie to answer them.
Great. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day and stay well.
All right.
Stay well, everyone. And I see Julie's playing with her audio. We'll see how it works. What